QSO Today, episode 258, Dino Papas, KL0S. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers for the radio amateur that are ready to enhance your contest season, and by QRP Labs, Hans Hummer G0 UPL's QRP Radio Kit Company. Hans has an amazing catalog of radio kits and parts for every budget. I want to thank both ICOM America and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for Z1UG, your host. Dino Papas, KL0S, leads the Williamsburg Area Amateur Radio Club in Williamsburg, Virginia, using the leadership skills that he acquired after 26 years in the U.S. Army. Dino is a frequent contributor to amateur radio magazines, including QST, offering his unique and needed perspective on our ham radio hobby. Along with his wife Toby, KL0SS, Dino provides a ham radio makerspace in his garage to share his knowledge and resources with his fellow hams. KL0S, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Dino?
Yeah, 4Z1UG. Greetings, Eric. This is KL0S in Williamsburg, Virginia. How are you?
I'm great, Dino. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Before we start at the beginning of your ham radio story, you have a KL0S, a KL0 call sign, which would put you in Alaska, but in fact you're in Williamsburg, Virginia. What's the story there?
Well, as we'll probably talk about in a little while, I was in the military and did a couple of tours in Alaska, and on the second tour actually got my first Alaskan call sign, which was AL7LZ, and then later I picked up the vanity call sign KL0S, and my wife is actually KL0SS, so we both have Alaskan calls. And then we maintained those calls when we returned to the continental United States. And I thought it was nice to sort of maintain that heritage. Plus, they're a little bit unique. It took a long time for folks to get used to the KL0 or KL any other number. Of course, they ran out of KL7 times 1 and 2 calls a long time ago, and then they started with the other numbers, KL0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so you'll hear those on the air as well nowadays, but it makes for a unique call sign.
Well, I was imagining that, in fact, that during the Christmas time you're Santa Claus and your wife is Mrs. Claus, but anyway, let's start at the beginning of your ham radio story. When and how did it start for you?
Well, my interest in ham radio actually began in the 8th grade or middle school here in the States when a classmate let me borrow a copy of the ARRL license manual. I was simply enthralled. Unfortunately, he wasn't licensed, and I didn't have a real Elmer then who could guide me along towards getting a license. So it wasn't until my sophomore year in high school when our electronics shop instructor, who was really the metal shop and wood shop teacher, just filling a requirement, and sadly really knew nothing about electronics. He was replaced by my first real Elmer, Truman Horton WB6 QFV, who is now Silent Key. He had been a Navy veteran and electronics technician, then became a teacher, and shortly after that, he gave me my novice test. I then got my general and advanced class licenses quickly, and I was hooked for life. I've been a ham now for 50 years and a 50-year ARRL member as well. So 50 years ago.
Okay, so you betrayed a couple of confidences here, and that is that your electronics teacher was, in fact, not an electronics teacher, but a wood and metal shop teacher. As soon as you said that, I thought, well, you must have been in the California public schools.
Yes, I was actually born in San Francisco, and my family moved to the other side of the Golden Gate Bridge to Marin County, and I went to high school at Redwood High School in Larkspur, California. They actually had a ham radio club before my electronics teacher arrived, so there were guys who were gathering to enjoy the hobby, but it really took off, of course, when we had a real mentor who became our electronics teacher.
Now, did you become a member of a ham radio club as a high school student?
Well, of course, we had the ham radio club there at the school, and the call sign at the time was WB6NVY. It's held by somebody else now because, as probably is the case with most high school and I would imagine university clubs, they've gone by the wayside. Yeah, I was a member of the Marin Amateur Radio Club at the time for a short time before I went off to college. So started with clubs early on.
Were clubs important to you while you were, finding your way in amateur radio?
Yeah, they really were. Of course, started with the high school club and the Elmers, the other members, and then after I got my degree and went off into the Army, the thing that I found was that as my wife, who was also a soldier and is a retired soldier now, as we moved around between assignments, ham radio was one of the immediate ins that we had into any community. And of course, the clubs in those areas then became a focal point for us. So ham clubs have been important to us all throughout our ham careers. And I've been the president of a couple of clubs. I'm currently the president of the Williamsburg Area Amateur Radio Club, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about clubs here in a little while as well.
Do you remember your first rig?
Yeah, my first rig was actually as a shortwave listener, and it was a Hammerland HQ100A, which was a wonderful little receiver that really didn't hear very well. When I got my license, my first novice rig was a Heathkit DX40, crystal controlled, of course, back in those days, and I used it with the HQ100A as a novice with a homebrew fan dipole at our house there near San Francisco. And I guess it was there that I got my first taste of DXing, which besides the technical side of the hobby is what really excited me almost continuously in the last 50 years of being a ham. Once I got my general license in late '69, my dad, bless his heart, bought me my first real ham transceiver, a Drake TR4, which he purchased from Amateur Electronics Supply, or AES for the older generation of hams who may be listening. They've gone out of business since. And I sold the TR4, but I kept the speaker and the power supply and married it up with a Drake C-Line, which I've kept I bought it new in '79, I think, and made modifications and recapping of both the radios and the power supplies. And I probably will never get rid of my Drake C-Line. I just love the old tube hybrid radios, and it'll be a long time before I were willing to give those up, even with the ICOM all solid state radios that I have now. They just look really nice there.
Yeah, they're a beautiful radio. Let me ask you though, do you actually turn the Drake C-Line on and use it? And under what conditions do you do that?
Periodically, there's a Drake Technical Net that meets on Sunday afternoons here on the East Coast, and I'll fire it up to talk to some of the friends that I know from the Dayton Hamvention, and I'll turn it on every once in a while to make sure it's still operating. Rigs get a little stale if you don't operate them every once in a while, so I'll get on, tune it up, make a QSO or two, and just to keep them in the mix, and then put them back to sleep for a while.
Do you remember your first contact on the air?
I have it in a logbook. I don't remember it. I was probably sweating bullets at the time, as every young new novice probably did. And it was probably in my ham radio club at school, but shortly, as soon as I got my license, I was working on putting the transmitter and receiver and the dipole together. It's probably where I learned one of my first technical lessons. It pays to fail. Antenna I put up, it fell down about an hour later, and then I learned how to put it up so that it would stay up. So failing is definitely a great way to learn.
What's your current rig?
Currently, I have a ICOM IC7851. It's a wonderful radio. It was a bit pricey, but it's probably the last HF radio that I'll have before I become a silent key. And I really like the operating convenience, and especially the dual receivers. That makes it very nice to be able to listen to a DX station and find a hole in the pileup up above or below that station. And the capabilities are really fantastic on that radio. So that's the one for me for now, for both my wife and I.
And what's your favorite operating mode?
Probably DX operating on any mode.
So you like CW, the digital modes?
Actually, I really like them all. I like to chase DX, and if they're on phone, fine, and if they're on CW, fine. If they're on the digital modes, I started out in RTTY with an old Model 19, so I've always been infatuated with radio teletype, and I still have some great terminal units here, but unfortunately, I don't have any mechanical machines anymore.
With a paper tape.
Yeah,
CQ, CQ, right?
Yeah, and I had a Model 20. I had a Model 28 KSR that when first we were in Alaska, and I could send CQ WB6 FZN stroke KL7 over and over again really fast. You get used to it.
Do you have an operating favorite of all time?
I think probably was the opportunity to talk to the Papa 5 station in North Korea when there was a World Food Organization volunteer operator there who was able to operate for several months, or maybe it was even up to a year. And I was able to break through the pileup and work him on single sideband. And then was fortunate enough to get him on radio teletype as well. And obviously, that's the most rare DXCC entity that there is today. So that's probably my favorite contacts of all time.
Right. P5 is North Korea. And, well, maybe in the next couple of years. You never can tell, right?
That's right.
How about that? Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, they did. Of course, ham radio was there in my high school club, and I figured that, well, what do I do when I go to college? Ham radio, electronics. I guess I might as well get an electrical engineering degree, which I did at University of California at Davis, which is near Sacramento there in California. But I was really destined for other things because I was commissioned an Army officer and spent 26 years on active duty as a light infantryman and paratrooper. My dad always would ask me why I didn't become an engineer after he paid for my college engineering education. And I guess I just loved being a soldier. Army service was in my genes. My mom and all her siblings, my granddad, all served in the military during World War II. I like to say that she was the first one to teach me how to march. My dad emigrated to the United States in the very early 50s, and he had been a radio operator in the Greek Merchant Marine and was really instrumental in my learning Morse code, along with, of course, the standard of the time, the Amico CW course on 33 RPM records. Yeah, it must have been in my genes, as I'm pretty good at CW. While I was in high school, our club attended a Hamfest where I sat down with the code proficiency test, and what I didn't realize was that my teacher, Truman WB6QFV, my first real Elmer, nudged the guy running the code machine to slowly increase the speed faster and faster. And the folks who were looking over my shoulder were amazed when I was still copying above 30 words a minute. I can copy faster than that, but even after all these years, but I just can't write it down that fast, and never really learned to copy it on a mill or a typewriter. But running high-speed traffic nets in the NTS system on 80 meters as a teenager was probably some of the best CW training that I had. But back to the degree part, as I said, I didn't follow on with my college degree to be a double E. Although I did go on to get a master's degree in engineering later in life. But as I said before, with all of the military moves, the wonderful thing about ham radio was that as soon as we moved into a new assignment, we always immediately had that that allowed us to meet the locals and quickly immerse ourselves in the greater community as well, besides the ham radio community.
This was obviously during the time of the Vietnam War. Were you drafted, or did you enlist?
Actually, I had an ROTC scholarship while I was in college, and I had a draft number. I think it was 304, as I recall. So there wasn't much chance that I was going to be drafted into the military. I probably would have gotten some kind of deferment anyway, but I really wanted to be a soldier, so I continued on with that. And when I graduated, they pinned gold bars on my shoulder, and 26 years later, I ended that career.
And now this message from ICOM America. Heard it, worked it, logged it. Now that field day has passed, we enter the contest season and hopefully more time to get on the air. It's time to get the ICOM transceiver that's best suited for your lifestyle. ICOM offers a variety of high-performance and innovative products. Make the most of the summer and contest season with one of these great ICOM rigs. The IC7610 is the SDR every ham wants, and just in time for contest season. This high-performance SDR has the ability to pick out the faintest of signals even in the presence of stronger adjacent signals. The new ICOM IC7610 is a direct sampling software-defined radio, SDR, that will change the world's definition of an SDR transceiver. The ICOM 7610 features include RF direct sampling system, 110 dB RMDR, independent dual receivers, and dual digicell. The IC7300 has changed the way an entry-level HF transceiver is designed. The rig is a high-performance, innovative HF transceiver with a compact design that will far exceed your expectations. I purchased one myself last fall and can tell you that the ICOM 7300 is as good or better than any rig I've ever had. The ICOM IC7300 includes RF direct sampling, 15 discrete bandpass filters, a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen, real-time spectrum scope, internal antenna tuner, and an SD card memory slot. No matter which ICOM rig you choose, you'll be a winner. Be sure to check out these fine rigs at www.icomamerica.com or click on the banner on the QSO Today show notes page. And when you finally go to make your ICOM purchase, be sure to tell the dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. And now back to our QSO. You were an active ham radio operator while you were in the military.
Yeah.
Did you have a chance to be an engineer in the military?
No, I chose. I guess it's kind of a funny story. I picked the at the time UC Berkeley had the Air Force ROTC program, and I kind of thought, well, the Air Force has probably got some of the best electronics, so maybe I'll go there. But that was too close to home. It was just across the bay from home, and I went to see the University of California at Davis on a sort of an orientation trip, and ran into the ROTC department. One of the captains there, big strapping airborne ranger infantry guy, and kind of the rest is history. I managed to keep up my ham radio career over the years throughout the assignments, but of course, like everyone, it ebbed and waned depending on how busy I was. But it was a wonderful career, and I'd be happy to talk about any part of it you'd like to.
I mean, one of the things that we talked about in the kind of the pre-show before we started recording was that your leadership in ham radio clubs. Do you think that the U.S. Army and your 26 years in it taught you about leadership and what it takes to put a successful group together and keep it together?
Oh, yeah, it's definitely the case. Now, you don't have to have been in the military to be successful at running any organization, but I think the military positions that I had over the years, I was everything between a rifle platoon leader all the way up to a brigade commander when I was a colonel. And you learn a lot of lessons along the way. And probably the most important one is that, especially as you get more senior, is that you have great people working for you, and you give them a little bit of guidance and let them be creative. Don't be afraid to fail. I think I mentioned that I'd been the president of 3 clubs and currently in one that's just an absolutely wonderful club. And we've done some really, I think, yeoman's work over the last couple of years.
For those of us that haven't been in the military, although I think most of our listeners may have been, the United States military has a reputation for being one of the best in the world. And so therefore, it's because they've mastered the idea of integrating a lot of people from a lot of different places and building teams. Okay. And I thought maybe you want to speak a little bit about how that's done.
Yeah, the military leadership thing, there's a real difference between leadership and management. And I could probably sit here and talk for hours about that, but developing leaders, I think, is important, And good leaders know how to build teams. They know how to put people together, and they know the strengths and weaknesses of folks. And because they've worked for people who did the same thing for them. It's almost like in the military, we called it mentorship. In ham radio, we call them Elmers. But we had mentors in the Army who we really looked up to, who we wanted to emulate, and we saw the strengths and sometimes the weaknesses that they portrayed as well. And you always tried to put those things together into your leadership package. And sometimes you did well, and sometimes you didn't. And that was important, I think, to be able to take someone and follow you into combat and convince them that that's what they need to do is a tough thing to comprehend, but a good leader can do that. And that translates into, I think, any organization, be it a software company or a manufacturing company or a ham radio club. The tenets of leadership can be taught, but sometimes you have to have an innate ability to bring those capabilities together. There's a direct translation between all types of organizations. It's just a little bit different in the military because of the risk involved, but in other organizations, risk may be monetary. It may be whatever fortune you may or may not be able to achieve. And in volunteer organizations, it becomes very important, whether it's a ham radio club or a stamp collecting club or coin collecting club or the American Red Cross, volunteer organizations. All of those organizations have the same requirements, really, to have people who can lead them towards whatever goal that they may have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. One of the things I remember as a kid is that there were all kinds of organizations. There was Kiwanis, there was the Rotary Club, there was the Lions Club, there were the Elks Club. And so there were lots of clubs, and a lot of our parents belonged to clubs. My mother included. She had her list of clubs. But I don't see that social clubs are strong, and in fact, they may be, waning and dying out. Do you see this? And what do you think it is in this point in our history that club membership seems to be not popular?
Well, that's a good question. The obvious answer is that we've become very individualistic based on social media. You would think that social media would really bring people together, but I think it actually drives people apart because there's not as much direct interaction between people. It's more electronic communication between people instead of face-to-face kinds of things. Specifically for ham clubs, I remember back in the late 60s, there was a 6-part series that was written by Carol Allen, W5NQQ, who had a 6-part series in 73 magazine between July and December, and it was called The Care and Feeding of the Ham Club. I actually wrote her a letter recently. Unfortunately, I didn't get a response, so she may very well be a silent key, although her QRZ page was still in place. It's interesting to note the things that clubs were doing then versus the things that clubs are doing now. They have the same problems, but the socio-economic piece of it may be a little bit different. From the military background, as we discussed, once again, for clubs today, by the way, I was going to write an article for QST on the care and feeding of the ham club based on my experience. But ham clubs are good, and some ham clubs aren't so good. And the ones that are welcoming, I think, are the ones that are really the best. You put people in charge, give them a bit of guidance, and let them be creative. It doesn't always work out, but for example, in our club, we really didn't have standing sub-organizations as you would find in the military. So we now have a training coordinator, somebody who does that for us. We have someone who's in charge of our food committee. We have someone who's specifically tasked with being the greeter so that no one who visits our ham club meeting ever is not welcomed, and they're not allowed to leave before we get their name and their call sign and their contact information. So we have to be proactive about that. Of course, you've got the community support piece, so we've got someone who's directly responsible for that, for the runs and the marathons and the marches and so on and so forth. And of course, obviously, our emergency communications. The club ought to be fun. And those people, they can't be one deep. A lot of clubs will have someone who's in charge of something for a long, long time, and they'll get burned out after a while. And the other side of that coin is people will tell you, well, we've always done it that way. And I hate to hear that, because just because we've done it one way doesn't mean it's the right way or it's the correct way for the times. The meetings, for example, need to be made interesting. We try and have interesting programs and limit the administrative minutia. And two of the things that we've really focused on is engaging the newcomers. The hour before the general membership meeting, we've started something called we call it the Hour of Power, just sort of pulled that out of the air. And that focuses on the new operator, so topics for them, putting up antennas, how do you get on the air, how do you operate a radio. And the other important thing I think we've done is reach out to the YLs. In terms of training, we've been pretty good. We technician class that we ran about 2 years ago, we had 12 students, surprisingly 6 males and 6 females, all of whom got their licenses. And we've made, as I said, a big pitch towards drawing YLs into the crowd to make them feel welcome. And several of those females and the males have gone on now to upgrading to general and extra class licenses. And our club now has 5 YLs who have their extra class license. And we're looking forward to hosting our first all-lady VE session sometime soon. So for the local population of male hams who haven't yet upgraded, I'm sure that will be an intimidating crew and VE session, to say the least.
What's the STP rule, and when does it apply to ham clubs?
Well, the STP rule is affectionately known as the same 10 people, and that's the thing that we try to get away from, because it's not just ham radio clubs, it's other clubs as well. The same 10 people always try to do, or always seemingly do most of the work of the club. When I took over the club a year and a half ago, I guess it was, my goal by the end of the first year was to make it, instead of 90-10, to make it 80-20. And hopefully by the end of the second term here, we'll get it down even lower than that. So putting people in charge, making sure that they're not one deep, giving them a little guidance and letting them be creative, because it's amazing what people will do, is the way to build an organization, especially a ham radio club, that is in fact vibrant and has a vision for the future. If you don't know where you're going, you're not going to get there very fast. So even as a club president, I know I won't be the president 5 years from now, but I kind of know where the club should be going. Whether it gets there or not along that path, that's okay. But like I said, if you don't have a road to follow, you're never going to get there.
Let me take a quick break here to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast with George, KG6VU, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. George and Jeremy document their projects and make circuit boards available for sale to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Even if you're a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, be sure to join George and Jeremy for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. And now back to our QSO today. It seems to me that a ham club is like eating a large elephant. You have to eat it one bite at a time, and the more people that you have eating it, the easier is it for it to go away. The question is, are you good at figuring out, by looking at a ham club member, what their strength might be and what little piece they could eat in order to be able to contribute to the whole project? And that way, so it's not 10 people, it's 30 or 40 people that are doing different things that they're successful at on the one hand, and they don't nobody wants to disappoint the team, right?
Yeah.
But if the job's too large, then they won't even take it to begin with.
Right, and that's a good point. Gauging someone's capabilities is, as it was in the military, is as important in a club organization as well. Overall, ham radio is a bell curve of people, just like the general population is. Not everyone is suited to be a ham radio operator, and sometimes I think we fool ourselves by saying that we want everyone to come join us in ham radio, when in actuality, it's just not a good fit for necessarily everyone. So concentrate on the folks that who would probably be most successful. In that light, the folks who are ham radio operators who are part of the club, as you said, you can tell whether or not sometimes they'll be good at something. But having said that, you never know about someone's innate abilities until you give them the opportunity to do so, because they'll surprise you sometimes. I like to say that 99 times out of 100, when I first meet someone, I kind of know what they're all about. Sometimes I'm very, very wrong about that person, but usually I am. So I'm pretty good at thinking about, well, who would be a guy who would be a good training coordinator, for example, who's done a wonderful job. So I'm very pleased that I picked him. Yeah, sizing folks up is important, but don't let that discourage you from picking someone who may have an ability that you just don't know about.
Now, you sent me a message before we started that you listened to the last episode with Stephen Bible. Actually, it's not the last episode. It's 2 episodes ago, episode 256, with Stephen Bible, N7HPR, about how to excite 14-year-olds. Now, it seemed to me that perhaps you don't have any idea how to excite 14-year-olds, or perhaps maybe your club does. Do you have kids in your club?
That's probably one of our, as it is with many clubs, probably our greatest failure at this point in time, to tell you the truth, is trying to break into that population. Frankly, the majority, our community is made up in large part by retirees, just because the Williamsburg area is a place to retire to. So we've had some minor inroads. We did an International Space Station contact for one of the local middle schools, and we had a wonderful experience doing that. We taught some classes beforehand to the kids, and they sort of ate it up. But unfortunately, kids are just so busy today with all of the things they do. Eric, you and I, when we were kids, we were probably out riding our bikes from dawn till dusk in the summertime, for example, and playing baseball. And
Tell Mom honk the horn.
Yeah, that's right. And you came back at dusk. And so I guess my point is, kids are so busy today that trying to engage them in another hobby may be a difficult thing to do. I've thought about that question from that other gentleman that you interviewed, and I'm not really sure how you do that, how you engage a 14-year-old, but you have to get them to understand that ham radio is something about self-achievement as well. Don Keith, N4KC, who I think you've talked to in a previous episode.
Right.
One of my favorite books is his volume "Riding the Shortwaves: Exploring the Magic of Amateur Radio," and he talked about questions from people of all ages as to why they should become ham radio operators, both kids and adults, who have instant communications today through social media, and ask, well, why do I need a radio? Why do I need to mess with that? And Don, I love his questions, because I ask the same ones of people who ask me why ham radio. He said, why do you go fishing? You can buy fish at the grocery store. Why do you play golf? Heck, you can take your golf ball and just walk up to the hole and drop it in. But take the N4KC challenge, pick up a telephone and dial a number in, I don't know, Slovenia, for lack of a better example, and call someone out of the blue and have a conversation with that person, or try to, and you're probably not going to have a conversation with that person. But if you talk to a Slovenian amateur radio operator with some equipment that you have put together yourself, maybe with an antenna that you've erected yourself, you may not have built the radio, you might have, probably not, but you designed the system and you put it together, and you soldered maybe the coax connectors and you ran it out to the antenna, and you talked to a guy in Slovenia who probably took an exam similar to the one that you did to prove that you can operate and you know how to do it safely and efficiently and within the rules, and you have an instant in with that person because of that shared background. And even though they may not speak English very well, you're going to communicate with that person, and you have a connection with that person, unlike someone you might dial on the phone randomly in Slovenia. It's because you did it yourself. And there's the magic. There's the connection with someone with similar interests.
Right. And when you travel abroad, I've had many guests who travel abroad and often visit the DX contacts in person that they connected to on the radio.
Yeah.
So that's a very cool thing. Before we started, you said that one of your favorite pastimes was melting solder. What do you melt solder on? And do you share your melted solder with others in the ham radio fraternity?
Yeah, I've loved the technical side of the hobby about as long as I have been a ham. I remember building my first Heath kit. It was an HW202 2-meter transceiver, and it actually worked the first time that I turned it on. It completely surprised me. But
I think I might have had that. Did that have the push button channel selectors?
Yep,
and the transmit and receive, it was crystal controlled, and the transmit and receive push buttons were different. So you could actually receive on 9.4 and transmit on 5.2.
That's absolutely right.
I had one of those. Yeah, that was cool.
It had the funky little white microphone. You remember
that? That's
that?
right. And it wasn't synthesized. It was crystal controlled.
Yeah, it was followed by the 2036, I think. That
right. I remember
actually
that.
Had the thumb wheel switches.
And it had a real live relay in it. So when you squeezed that cute little white microphone, the thing went chunk.
I love the technical side of the hobby, and have done so, for a long, long time. But the real joy I think I get out of ham radio today is sharing my knowledge and experience with other hams. That's why we started in 2014. Our club, I volunteered to start what we call a builders group. And my ex-wife, Toby, KL0S, and I are blessed with a conditioned garage space. And that has become a workshop where our members have gathered for bi-weekly sessions in the spring and in the fall to design and build and repair and learn about the technical side of the hobby. Along with the builders group, we've also hosted get-togethers where folks have shared their experience with crimping coax connectors and building off-center fed dipole antennas. We had a antenna build-a-thon one weekend where I think 16 of us got together, and we built 11 off-center fed dipole antennas that were going to be used by the new hams who had just gotten their HF privileges. And, oh, by the way, a couple of the older hams were interested in as well, and they wanted to build antennas. So we like to do that. And sharing my experience has come about in other ways. I like to write, and I've as you know, I've had several articles published in QST over the years. I actually started writing about ham radio back with a first article in 73 magazine in 1984, where I described how to interface my Apple II computer for teletype. And then later on, I had some articles in Popular Communications and Monitoring Times. But over the last few years, for my club members and friends around the country, I've penned about 36 KL0S shack notes, I call them. And once again, we shared them with club members and friends around the country. And then I offered those up to the ARRL, and I think 11 of them were selected as the genesis for both articles and hints and hacks. I really like hints and kinks, what it used to be called.
Right.
I'm not sure I like hints and hacks, but they were picked up for that. And just this past week, for example, I started sharing a new series of KL0S tech tips that are going to be sort of one-page discussions of general radio desk and workbench things that I've learned over the years that may be helpful to new and old hams.
Can we go back a little bit, though, back to Builders Group? Because I don't want to go too fast through that. What does it take to build a Builders Group? You say you have a space in your garage. What did you have to do to prepare to have people come to build something? How did you choose the first project, and what was it?
Yeah, actually, I wrote one of my QST articles back in February of 2015 was called a Ham Radio Makerspace. And that article covered how I got started and what we do.
How did you make the first meeting of the Builders Group? Who did you invite? What was the project?
Okay, well, I brought it up at a club meeting one night to see if people might be interested in getting together and working on projects, since I've always enjoyed building my own ham radio equipment, and I really wanted to share that with folks. I think I may have mentioned that my wife and I are blessed to have a conditioned garage space here at our home, and I thought that would provide a year-round satisfactory place where we could have basically a ham radio maker space. And I think I mentioned earlier that this whole process was described in a QST article back in February of 2015. But I'll give you the rundown here of what we had to do. The first thing was to figure out whether anybody wanted to participate or not. And I got some feedback from probably 10 to 15 people who said they might be interested. And once I had that, I decided, well, how do we put this all together? The space itself, I decided that we needed tables, we needed power, and we needed lights at those tables and chairs. So I went out and bought all that stuff and set it up. And we thought about a project that everyone would work on, but the opposite was actually true. Everybody sort of had something they wanted to do. And for those people who weren't sure what project they wanted to work on, we gave them examples of kits and articles and things that they could consider. It's interesting that several of the people who have participated in the Builders Group over the years since 2014 have actually designed projects that other folks have then taken on as their own. We had a bench power supply that one of our members designed, a triple output bench power supply. And then most recently, one of our members designed his own electronic load. And I think 5 or 6 people have followed suit with that, because that is probably one of the most useful pieces of test equipment on my bench. And I didn't know how useful it was until I actually got one.
Now, did everyone bring their own tools? Like, did you create a list of hand tools that they should have, that they should bring, and that they're responsible for, or did you provide all the tools?
It was kind of a mixture of both. It is a bring your own tools affair. What most people will do is they'll bring their own small soldering station, whether it's a Weller or some other Chinese brand, for example, and they'll bring the basic hand tools along with them, pliers and solder and screwdrivers to work on their project. And then what I do is I make my bench, which is directly above the garage space, available to folks in case they need to do more either troubleshooting, or they need a hot air gun, or they need whatever piece of equipment that I might have upstairs. And if you've seen the picture of my bench, you'll probably see that we can do some pretty pretty exciting stuff all the way up to 3 gigahertz with the test equipment there. So that's available to them. Sometimes it gets really crowded here in the shack, even in the large room that we have, and people will go back and forth between upstairs and downstairs. But to answer your question, it's bring your own basic tools, and we've probably got either the part or tool to help you build or fix whatever you bring to the group.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, is there a participation fee or something that pays for parts or whatever?
Most people, obviously fund their own project. The one thing that we do provide, probably maybe the most important thing, is the coffee machine and donuts. Our group, our ham radio club, is probably one of the eatingest groups that I've ever been involved with. We have every Saturday morning is breakfast somewhere at one of the 1 million pancake houses here in Williamsburg. And we get together for lunch every Wednesday. That's another thing retired people do, is they eat a lot. But we don't charge anything for it. My wife and I are blessed, and we feel like we're giving back to the community by making the space and a couple of donuts and a few cups of coffee every once in a while free to everyone. It's not a big deal.
How important has the ham radio makerspace been to kind of sealing the relationships in the ham radio club?
It's interesting when you're a leader, as we talked about earlier, of any organization. You kind of get to know everyone, at least at a basic level, and it's really interesting to have two members come together who really didn't know one another before, and get to know each other, and then become friends and become compatriots in the hobby, and that folds back into the ham club topics that we've been talking about, is getting people together. I'll give you a good example. I think I don't want to stray too far from the topic, but most ham clubs that I've been in have. You get together, the president bangs the gavel, and everyone sits quietly, and then what they'll do is they'll go around the room and introduce themselves by name and call sign. And that's about it. What we've done in the last 2 years is we started something called the brag can. It's just an old tin can with the brag can marked on it, and the number's 25 cents. So when I make the first introduction, we put a topic up on a slide, what it is we want people to talk about for just 25 words or less kind of thing. You drop a quarter into the brag can, and you tell us about what your latest DX contact was, for example. And what that's done is, although it takes a lot of time in the meeting sometimes when you have 40 or 50 people in attendance, is it allows people to see other people in terms more than just their name and call sign. They get to hear about what they're working on in their workshop. They get to hear about who their latest DX contact has been. They get to hear who their first Elmer was, for example, and topics like that. They change from month to month. And one of the side benefits, of course, is it makes about $10 a month for the club to put in the kitty as well. But the important thing, obviously, is it gets people to know one another better.
Yeah, that sounds really great. One of the reasons that we're speaking, Dino, is that I saw an article that you wrote in January of 2019 in QST magazine about electrostatic protection inside the ham shack.
Uh-huh.
And since we're kind of talking about melting solder and stuff, it seems to me that with computerized ham radio equipment now and all the marriage of all of the stuff that we're doing, that electrostatic discharges in a ham shack could be maybe not dangerous, but quite dangerous to the equipment itself. How do you approach this problem for those people that haven't read the article, and what should we pay attention to?
Well, first of all, I've been playing around with electronics for 50 years now. Of course, electrostatic sensitive stuff probably for a little less than that. And frankly, I've never zapped anything. But that doesn't mean I don't take the precautions not to have that happen. And maybe because I do, it's never happened. As I think I said in the article, the potential is always there, especially if you live in a humid or a non-humid, dry climate, as it does here on the East Coast. It gets very dry in the wintertime, and touching a doorknob or a lamp fixture or something will sometimes generate quite a spark. Well, if you think about it, that spark could be injected into an electronic part that is obviously ESD sensitive. So what do you do about that? Well, at the workbench, you can get yourself relatively inexpensively a mat that will discharge electrostatic charges, and then instead of going into your piece of equipment or your component, it'll be dissipated into the mat, and you need to connect that to your station ground, or actually your electrical ground, and you can do that at least easily here in the United States by connecting that mat to the screw that holds the cover plate onto your electrical outlet cover. At my radio desk, when I'd sit down, I could draw a pretty good spark across a piece of equipment. So what I did is I took a small piece of printed circuit board and connected it to the station ground that connects all of the equipment here at the radio desk, and then to the electrical ground, and hooked a 1 megohm, I think, resistor to it, and then to ground. And before I sit down, I just reach over and I touch that piece of printed circuit board, and I'll discharge myself to it before I ever have the potential of doing it to a radio. Of course, radios, as you mentioned, have become so computer dependent nowadays that the potential exists. I have a Drake L4B amplifier. It's got two 3500Zs in the amplifier, and I like to say that the only computer in that very, very old amplifier is really the only microprocessor in that amplifier is the one between my ears. But there's a lot of other gear here on the bench that could be impacted by ESD, and it's not hard to protect yourself. I did get a couple of notes following that article from folks who had read it, who said it was a good start, but there are more things that could be done. And you have to strike a balance between, just like in the military, you figured risk, what the risk is, what you can do about it, what you do about it, and then make sure you've done it. Risk management. So you strike a balance of the amount of protection that you give yourself. Is it important to the average ham? Yeah, probably so. And that's why I wrote the article and gave a few tips on how to protect yourself.
You have an upcoming QST article that offers suggestions about how we can best prepare our families for our inevitable day of becoming a silent key, called A Ham Silent Key Guide, which will appear in the upcoming September 2019 edition of QST. Can you offer some points from that guide before we read the article?
I've been involved over the years in a number of silent key estate kind of affairs where the family approached me to help them dispose of a ham's equipment. And it really came to light when Noel Beardsley, K8NB, wrote an article in the April 2018 issue of QST, and it was titled The Inventory List. And what Noel was trying to get folks to do was at least have an inventory of the equipment that you have. And my article is following up on his seminal idea. and offering some guidance on how I've gone about helping families with the disposition of their loved ones' equipment. It's inevitable that we're all going to become a silent key at some point in time. So whether or not you want to make it as easy as possible on your family at that time is really up to you now. A good ham club can help, either formally or informally. And when you think about it, as you said, ham's collection of radios and test equipment and parts and antennas and towers can be really significant. And when you compare that to, for example, people who collect stamps, who are model railroaders, all of those hobbies could have extensive stuff. And you really need to plan now for what happens to your stuff. For example, one of my side hobbies has been over the last 50, I guess almost 60 years, is collecting comic books. I have a fairly sizable comic book collection that somehow I'm going to have to dispose of. And if I don't dispose of it, my XYL is going to be burdened with it, or the rest of my family. So my whole idea is to do the planning now to prepare your family to be able to deal with your estate once you're gone. And remember, you can become a silent key at a moment's notice. So pre-planning is really important. In that light, maximizing the monetary return to your family, I think, is important. Your family may not need that monetary return. They may choose to memorialize their ham in some way. But some folks, the family, the money coming back to them is important, and how you go about disposing of equipment can be a pretty daunting task. All of the ones that I've been involved with have taken a year or more to finally get to the last piece of equipment and then the last return to the family. So the message for folks, I think now, and what I'll talk about in the article, is to organize your stuff now. And of course, you really need to have your will and your trust and your medical directives current and in place. And another interesting thing you may want to do, this may sound a little morbid, but you may want to write your own obituary, because who knows you better than yourself? I've got one sitting around here somewhere in the just in case file for my XYL. And once again, may sound a little morbid, but could be a smart thing to do. Finally, the real key to this, I think, is finding some trusted friends and have the conversation, trusted ham friends who are willing to help your family once you become a silent key, either unexpectedly or in the long term. Have them have a conversation with the other members of your family about how that might take place in the future.
Do you think there's a role for ham radio clubs to actually have this person now in there? It seems to me if your Williamsburg Amateur Radio Club is mostly of older people, perhaps there should be a committee that actually has a process and procedure for guiding an XYL through this process.
I think it all depends on the club and the personalities of the people in the club. For our club, for example, it's really been an informal affair of having people ready to do that. But you're absolutely right, and it actually is one of those bites of the elephant that I'm trying to get done, is to establish something that more formalizes what families, at least someone who they can contact, for example, that you can tell, your ham friend who doesn't have any other members of the family who are hams, and you may very well not even have ever been introduced to other members of their family, to have something to say, hey, if I'm suddenly a silent key tomorrow, and call Joe Smith, KL0S or whatever, and say, hey, can you help? And sometimes that's when you come into the conversation. That makes it much more difficult, of course, but that doesn't mean that it's not a very useful and fulfilling thing for someone to do. It's frankly a lot of hard work, but the satisfaction that you get from helping someone else is really amazing. And to answer your question, yes, it should be a part of a club, but it really depends on the club.
What do you think the greatest challenge is facing amateur radio now?
Well, I think everyone's going to agree that getting younger folks interested in the hobby is probably our biggest long-term challenge. As I mentioned, the community that we live in here is predominantly retired folks, and our club has kind of made a conscious decision that focusing our efforts on folks who have the time and maybe the disposable income to enter into the hobby is where we will get in the short term the best bang for the buck. In the long term, that I think will have an impact on then reaching out to the younger generation, potentially through children and grandchildren. But it's hard to get into the school system, for example, to even be able to offer ham radio as an option. We even contacted one of the local private schools to see if we could start small, and just the amount of administrative background checks, for example, for people who are coming into the school to be able to interact with students is sometimes a daunting affair. Probably one of the more target-rich environment, pardon me for using a military term, is the homeschooling environment, because we've been approached by some of them to provide some opportunities to add to the science, technology, engineering, and math, or the STEM programs that they have. So we're going to start small with that. But it's really hard, and I am totally open to anybody's idea. I thought we really might have an in when we did the ARIS contact for the local middle school, but as I think I mentioned before, those kids are just so busy with other things that trying to get them excited about ham radio is tough. But having said that, the one kid, the one adult, the one teenager, the one geriatric person that you can get excited about that self-satisfaction of being able to do something on your own with ham radio, that's the person that hopefully that we can reach.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Oh, obviously the technology of stuff. I with an engineering schooling background and playing with ham stuff and the technical side of the hobby for 50 years, I never thought that I would be behind the times, but I'm actually finding myself rapidly falling behind the cutting edge stuff, unfortunately, of ham radio. And that's what actually excites me. The ARRL tells us that they ask, what do hams do? And we communicate, experiment, build, compete, serve our communities, and engage in lifelong learning. The engage in lifelong learning is the thing that I think is most exciting for me. After I retired, I went back to the community college just for grins and took all of those courses that I really didn't enjoy all that much when I was in an undergraduate. I just love taking calculus and differential equations and chemistry and physics and all of that stuff. That lifelong learning piece, I think, is an important aspect of ham radio that anyone from the 6-year-old who gets their license all the way up to the 100-year-old who has a license and has been operating for many, many years. There's always something to learn. So I would ask folks when you think about what the ARRL says we do, to see how you measure up to those things: communicating, experimenting, building, competing, serving your community, and engaging in lifelong learning.
Yeah, I might point out that while these QSO Today interviews are not pegged in time, it just so happens I got my July 2019 QST magazine the other day, and the CEO of the ARRL actually spelled out what those things are in his letter to the readers. So I might point that out for those that want to actually understand what the amateur radio service is about. And it's a good, I guess, measuring stick to see whether or not we're, actually doing it. What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
I guess the advice that I would give to new or returning ham radio operators would be, don't be afraid to fail at something. Whether it's building your own equipment, your antennas, configuring your radio and computer for a new digital communications mode, striving for DX or participating in contests, or the thousands of other things that ham radio offers you to learn and experiment with. Our hobby has so many opportunities to learn about it and try that you can go for a lifetime and never experience them all. I think, Eric, after 50 years as a ham now, I know that I've only scratched the surface. I have a sign next to my workbench that says, everything is hard until you figure out how to do it. And I think the message is the satisfaction of succeeding far outweighs the small setbacks and frustrations you'll encounter along the way.
Dino, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I've learned a lot about leadership and perhaps things that our local ham club can do that maybe it's not doing around all kinds of issues. I'm enthralled with the idea of the ham radio maker space, and think that's a great place to go. I think that we have a lot of new hams that don't know how to use test equipment or even how to build a dipole antenna, and they're afraid to ask. So by volunteering to do those things, perhaps we'll get those people in, and they'll be doing things, and won't be afraid to fail, and they'll just learn like we all learn. I want to thank you very much and wish you 73. Thank you for joining me.
Hey, Eric, it's been an honor, considering the long list of ham radio notables that you've interviewed, for you to ask me to be part of this, and hopefully in some small way, some idea that I may have helped germinate in someone is satisfactory to me, and it's been enjoyable talking to you. Thanks very much, and 7-3.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Dino. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in KL0S in the search box at the top of the page. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages, or when you make your purchases, that you say that you heard it here on QSO Today. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the other episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Libsyn, and TuneIn, as well as the iTunes Store. If you own an Amazon Echo, you can say, Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn. I still use Stitcher to listen to podcasts on my smartphone. The links to all of these services are on the show notes pages on the right side. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.